you have to show up. You have to learn to just like show up to events alone. And that's what I started. That's literally how I started.
Yeah.
I didn't know like anybody really, like maybe a handful of people.
Yeah.
I would literally just show up to, I would see something online on social media and be like, oh, this looks cool. I'll go show up. I would go alone. Just be like, you know, what's your name? Oh, cool. I just moved here. Oh, you too? Cool. Let's get coffee. Like you have to do that. You have to go out of your way and be comfortable in your own skin and introduce yourself to people.
Let's link up with Krista on the FYX. She's a wellness coach with a focus on mental well-being and physical strength.
What's up, FYX listeners? Welcome back to our latest episode of the FYX podcast. I'm your host, Krista Huber, and I've got a guest for you guys to kick off the month. Pretty much all of January, it was me, my mic, and a lot of my opinions, but I'm excited to welcome my now good friend, Sandalina, who I met just a few weeks before this recording. Chance meeting at an event that we were both attending in support of a mutual friend. We just got to talking. We really clicked. As you'll hear, she herself is also a podcast host. We have a ton of things in common just around she still is in the corporate finance world, a world that I was a part of when I first started my career and made the transition out of that. In this episode, we talk a lot about social media and our relationship to social media. Of course, this is still coming on the heels of people's reactions to everything that's been going on with various platforms. So hopefully we're not tired of hearing about it, because I think it's a really important topic, in particular because Sandalina is our Gen Z voice for the podcast. I sat here and as I was thinking through this when she and I were speaking, I realized that I haven't had too many people from Gen Z on this podcast. And you'll hear me say this to her, gave her a bunch of compliments. And I know she was like, oh, thank you. Thank you. And Sandalina, as you're listening to this, I just truly want to emphasize, impressive woman, very well-spoken, really, really love this conversation. And one of the things that I said to her was like, oh, like, I haven't had the chance to really ask somebody who is a part of Gen Z to give me their take on how they relate to social, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Instagram, what it was like growing up, because she was just by default of when she was born, introduced to these things much younger than me. And I know, just knowing the demographics of this show and of this audience, a lot of you did grow up in the time well before social media, and you remember your childhood without a computer. So to be able to hear kind of like the different phases of this evolution of technology, of how quickly technology has changed our worlds, changed our perspectives, changed our interactions with each other. And I really admire Sandalina as somebody who is using social media as a way to connect with people in person. All that said, what you will hear is the underlying common thread of this entire conversation. When we talked about health, when we talked about balancing our schedules, when we talked about our relationship to TikTok, when we talked about our perspectives on what it's like to understand Asia, Southeast Asia, China, understanding just information and access to information, taking in too much information, controlled information. It comes down to one thing. It comes down to you being very clear on you. Your relationship with yourself, knowing what makes you tick, knowing where you need to have a boundary. And as I reflect on this word boundary and think about how it's gotten thrown around I'd say like the last 2 years, sometimes I think it's like this bad rep of being like very intense of like, oh, no, I have to put up this boundary. And I think people take it to an extreme. But what we really get into here and really highlight here is knowing the boundaries of what's going to serve you. And for all of my clients who know this, when we talk about this in the context of fitness specifically and of losing body fat and just leading a healthier life, but leading the life that you want by design, it all comes down to thinking about your future self. How would your future self show up? What does he or she desire? What do you want to feel? How do you want to feel as a result of the decision that you're making right now? How do you want to feel about it in this moment? But how do you want to feel about it 6 months from now, even a week from now, 2 years from now? And I really admire Sandalina's ability in her mid and early 20s to have very clearly spent the time figuring this out for herself. And from what I gather, it sounds like she's been able to use social media to do that. And I think that's amazing. I think that's such an incredible use case for it. And for as much as in last week's podcast episode, I talked about the concerns I had about our general, like the population's general response to losing TikTok for but a few hours. This episode is like the bright light of all the possibility, of all of the connectivity in the world, of what you'll hear me refer to towards the end of our conversation of the invisible string. That serves its place in fitness, that serves its place in nutrition, that serves its place in you just wanting to lead your best and brightest and biggest life. And it also serves a place if you're somebody who's here because you too are a business owner. You too are trying to figure out how you want to show up, what you want your brand to look like, how you want to be as a brand. We really go deep in a lot of different areas, but yet it comes back to this one central theme. And I love those types of conversations. So I'm going to shut up because I want you guys to dive into this episode, listen to it a couple of times because there really is so much to get from it. I think this will be a fun one for if you're commuting in your car, if you're going for a walk, whatever it is that you're doing, but can't wait to hear the feedback. And with that, let's welcome Sandalina to the FYX podcast. Sandalina, welcome to the FYX podcast. So excited to have you share your story, talk about how we met because I feel like it's kind of fun. It was just a random, meant to be connection, which is really awesome. And just dive into so many different things and all of the cool work that you're doing. So thank you first and foremost for joining us today and getting to know the FYX listeners and letting them getting to know you. But before we get started, I like to have a little icebreaker question, if you will. I'm a big coffee drinker. I don't know that I shared that with you when we first met. Love coffee, never met a cup of coffee I didn't like. So I like to ask my guests, what's your go-to coffee order in the morning? And if you don't drink coffee, that's okay. What are you sipping on to start your day?
First of all, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you for having me. It's an
Of
honor and
course.
privilege to be here. So I want to get that out of the way first and foremost. I'm really excited to be here. To answer your question, so I actually don't I don't drink coffee. I was just talking
All
about this
good,
last
girl.
night with somebody. Yeah, I don't drink coffee. I just do cold water. That's all I drink throughout my weekdays. So yeah.
You keep it nice and simple. Did you just never get into it or you don't like the taste?
I don't like the taste. I also feel
Fair.
jittery on caffeine. I feel like I just get super I went to a Yemeni coffee house, one in New York that's pretty well known in the community. And
Yeah.
I was just shaking after it. And I was like, I can't do this. So I don't know if it's for me.
Hey, listen, I mean, not that I was necessarily planning on diving too much into health specifically in this conversation, but that's one of the reasons why I like asking this question because there are pluses and minuses to caffeine. But
Yeah.
What you just said is the most important thing and something that I focus on with every client I work with, every message that I really try to have is the undertone of what I'm putting out on social media, et cetera, is what's going to work for you comes down to you knowing your body, trusting your body, and actually listening to it, right? So the fact that you realize hey, just because everybody else drinks this doesn't mean I have to jump on the train. And you're getting the feedback. If it's making you jittery, we know it doesn't agree with you, and that's okay. So, hey, there you go.
I love that.
Right?
This is such a safe space. I love it.
Exactly. So, yeah. So, I appreciate you sharing that. And, obviously, I'm going to endorse H2O and being hydrated. So, you keep doing your thing there, girl.
Thank
Cool.
you.
All right, this is going to be a hard pivot because we go from the fun question straight into the juice. And that is, I know that you have done really cool things. I know what you are building with your podcast. And obviously, we'll talk more about that and just being a really true representative of your community, your culture, your background. But with that in mind, instead of giving me the typical elevator pitch resume kind of response to who you are, because we know you could do that all day long, right? I want to know, who is Sandalina at her core? If you wanted somebody to just remember you for who you are, deep down as a person, what would that be? Why do you want somebody to listen to the rest of this episode when they could easily go listen to another podcast?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say, who am I outside of all the things I do, all the titles I possess?
Yes.
I would say I'm somebody that's just a very introspective, critical thinker. I feel like that's something actually to a fault, I would argue almost. Sometimes I think I definitely have a tendency to overthink and spiral a bit with those thoughts. But I feel like the most important thing that I've understood throughout my experience in childhood and adulthood is it's really important to kind of think independently. And if that means going against the grain, that's fine. But I think just the beauty of formulating your own path, your own opinions, and not falling victim to herd mentality and sheep mentality is something that I think about very often, especially when we look at, I know that's not the point of this episode, but especially when we look at everything that's happening in
No,
the
this is
news,
good.
right?
Go.
Like
Yeah,
politically too.
sure.
And then you said, communities going head to head. And it's really important to kind of step away and just be like, okay, what holistically is going on? How do I feel? What do I think? How do I want to proceed? And I think that bleeds into everything: friendships, relationships, work, side projects, family. So my biggest thing is just think independently, consume, and think critically. I would say at my core.
Yeah, I love that. And honestly, that is the point of any of these conversations that we have, right? Because when I have a guest on here, and even when I'm on here like riffing off about whatever topic that I feel pretty passionate about, that really is what podcasting essentially is all about, right? And we can go in so many different directions with this conversation, which is the beauty of it, which is the beauty of being a multifaceted person. When we first met, obviously one of the things we connected on was podcasting, but also the hustle involved of having a full-time job, what it's like to navigate that, how to make the leap from a corporate job into owning your own business. All of those different things are points and topics that a lot of other listeners can connect on. But I do think what you just said, especially just about this concept of like not following the herd and having your own perspective, lane, niche, whatever, I do really think that's a good segue for you to talk about why you started your podcast and what you do, because it is niche in that regard. No. So why don't you share with the listeners just kind of like the backstory on it and what your goal is of it and who you talk to specifically, because to me, that's what makes it unique.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it because it is very much in the background, not by design. It's just what my set is. But yeah, no, so I have a talk show podcast called Spotlight with Sandalina. My name's Sandalina, so we're shining a spotlight on our guests, right? So it's basically a show that does a vulnerable deep dive with South Asian and or Muslim creators in New York City. And the backdrop is, so I moved to New York in 2022, right after I graduated college. I came, young and wide-eyed on Wall Street. I was an investment banking analyst. And I know you and I have talked offline about sort of our experiences in corporate, more traditional corporate spaces. And I was really jaded, right? I was amongst, I was with people that weren't really representative of like the culture and community that I grew up with, which is totally fine. I recognize there's like compartmentalization between like work and personal.
Yeah.
But I think in my sparingly free time that I did have, I was very adamant on like, okay, I need to like get out there and like meet more people that look like me. So I went to this South Asian New York Fashion Week in fall of 2022. It was the first year of it. So I went, out some friends modeling. And then I was just exposed to this world of like South Asian people in entertainment that were completely good. Because, with brown kids, you grow up, you're like, going to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. That's kind of it, right? So I was just baffled to see all these people that look like me that were pursuing paths that were so starkly different from the traditional norm, right? Premeditated paths our parents have for us. So I was just like, well, and they were good at it too. They weren't just like rebelling as like a screw to their parents. They were like genuinely good at the stuff that they were doing. They're modeling, acting, dancing, singing, influencing. And I was just so jarred. I just didn't know this universe existed because of course I grew up in the Bay Area, so I would have never seen that there, right?
Yeah. Right.
So I just kind of felt, there's something here. And I think as time went on, I started making TikToks on the side and had some reach and stuff there. But I got to a point where I was like, what is my talent? What is my niche? And I still don't know if I'm the best person on the planet at it, but I know that it's something that I enjoy doing, which is just like brain dumping and like really digging into the inner crevices of somebody's mind and like their journey and like who makes them who they are. The same thing that you do, right? And I think that's part of why we connected so well.
Sure.
But I took all of this and I was like, I want to make something out of this. There's a white space. I don't see a Muslim woman running a talk show. Like that's just like that thing that doesn't happen. So I want to bring in the Muslim creator spaces, the South Asian creator spaces, and just bring these people in front of bright lights and a camera for an hour. And it's like, who are you? And I have a very, I do my stuff all in person. So it's like a very fun sort of experience for the guests, hopefully too. And some of them open up about some like really beautiful stuff, which I think the message is I want people at home, especially this podcast is for everybody, but I recognize it's like targeted towards South Asians and Muslims. But I want people at home watching this, maybe a younger audience to be like, oh, wow, like I didn't know that the world could be my oyster because nobody told me that. So that's the whole point, is just to sort of inspire and be like, we're more alike than we are different, because social media is a very, it can be a deceiving place. So yeah.
No, for sure. And I think to your point, like one of the last things that you just mentioned, and really you started off with this point too, of your upbringing, your background, the stereotypes that 100%, like, while you could say like, oh yeah, like somebody growing up in this culture had these expectations put on them by their parents. We could break that down based on region of where you live, based on your ethnicity, so many different demographics, right? Yeah. But I also think where you are saying that it is a universal thing, your point of like, you're talking about this from your perspective, from how you grew up inside of your community and how it was really eye-opening to you. But at the same time, I think it's also really cool because if you have that stereotype, let's be clear, there are other people who have that stereotype too, right? So for as open as you were to be, or I opened as you were to be like, oh, wow, like I didn't know that a lot of these people were pursuing other things, arts, careers in different areas. And like you said, good at it. This wasn't more of like a F you to my mom and dad. Let me go off and do this thing and be rebellious. Like they truly pursued this out of passion. Yeah. There are people, no matter your race, where you grew up, like again, all these different demographics that we can break down that can relate to that fact. Yeah. And then, like you're saying, the social media aspect of it too, like really just kind of warps your reality. And, you know, something that I would love to ask you, I think you're probably, I'm like trying to go through my head. I'm almost at 200 episodes. So I say this like pretty confidently, but I think you may be one of the youngest guests. Like I can only think of one other person that I've had on my show who's like right around your age. And you're so well spoken, by the way. And I have to compliment you for that, because I think just like if I could give a reason why I haven't had guests like in a younger age range, it's honestly just because I haven't necessarily come across as many people who have the confidence and have the ability to turn on a microphone, feel comfortable being interviewed, and actually can hold a conversation that someone wants to listen to. Like candidly, that's what it comes down to. So shout out to you for that. But I think you're a good person to ask this question because of your generation. Let's talk about social media. Yeah. What has it been like for you coupling in, like you said, growing up in the Bay Area as a brown kid, somebody who had this expectation of pursuing a very specific career path, which you did, right? And you fell into a lot of these buckets, but you also have a unique and interesting life experience because most of your life, you remember technology, the internet, and very much like you're not that young, but when we think about it, and I think this is a perspective for you to add too, it like blows my mind to think that like the generation below each of us will have grown up in a world where social media never was not a thing. Like that is so wild to think about, that like someone born in the last 10-ish years, 15-ish years, by the time they get to be in their mid to late 20s and early 30s, they will have never known a world where social media was not a thing. And like I grew up, and I'm not like there's not a huge age gap between us, but enough that like we had different childhoods, I'm sure. And I grew up when like, I remember like we had one computer in our house, and my mom was like, yeah, there has to be a limit on like what we would play, like backyard soccer. I don't even know if you would remember this game. It might not have been around when you were a kid because I'm a couple of years older than you, but my brothers and I would be like, okay, who gets to play next? Like who gets to use the computer next? Whereas now it's like kids have tablets, they have phones, whatever. And that's not like a thing. And we were still very much encouraged, go outside, get away from that kind of stuff. And not to say that kids aren't, but just the thought of the level of access of information that we have today and how that will become that generation's complete norm is pretty mind blowing. So I'd love for you to share just knowing the experiences you've had in your life thus far, coupled with the timing of when you were born and what society has evolved into. How does that land for you? Like thinking about how social media plays a role in your life, both maybe positively and negatively.
Wow, that's a really great question. Also, thank you for everything you said earlier. Yeah, I'm very flattered. I'm still
like
taking that in. Thank you. But yeah, no, social media. Now, this is a really interesting one. My relationship with social media has definitely ebbed and flowed throughout the years. So to your point, I think I was sort of the last like part of Gen Z that didn't necessarily grow up on social media from a very young age.
Cusp.
But
right?
I literally had this exact conversation last night. So much of this is relevant. I was right. So I was like in 4th or 5th grade, and like MySpace was just dying out. AIM was just dying out. And I had just hopped on. Like I had just hopped on those ones. MySpace, I think I hopped on because,
to think about.
Yeah, it was. I hopped on MySpace for like 2 seconds because like I thought that I could connect with like Disney Channel stars on it. Like I was just my own like 9-year-old delusion. Okay, and then the AIM. I
That's
just
so
remember
good.
one of my cousins, her and I, we would just like go on Club Penguin and like DM on AIM. Like that was like
Oh
our
my
thing.
God,
Okay.
Club Penguin. I forgot about that one.
So that was kind of what was going on there, and then yeah. So after that, I think it very quickly evolved into Facebook. It very quickly evolved into
Mhm.
Instagram. Now, at a young age, you're like a kid in a candy store. You're like, oh my God, I have so many data points at my fingertips. Oh, I got to see so much and learn so much. And oh, I got to connect with my friends when we're not in school and we got to talk about this thing. And
Mhm.
like, this is so cool. So when you're at a young age, it's very easy to get swept up into the wave of social media. And I would actually argue that it was probably a positive thing for me in the world that I grew up in. So when I grew up in Cupertino, California, which is very like, like competitive and very focused on, what college you get into. And I appreciate the beauty in that too, by the way. It's not bad, I would say. But when it came to student government elections, I've always been like a student government nerd. So
Oh my
I
God, me too. I knew we liked each
really?
other. Yeah, I was like, for everybody who listens to this that knew me in high school, they'll laugh. But I was like the, middle school and high school, like student council president, like all those things. I was like really into that. Yeah.
That is insane. So I have a
Yeah.
theory on a tangent. I have a theory that student government people all find each other in the adult world. Cheerleaders find each other in the adult world. I used to cheer in high school and I have like a few friends that are like
That's so
former cheerleaders
funny.
too. And I'm like, we don't even know that. And then I also
Yeah.
think like DECA, like these business clubs, like those
Yes.
equivalents find each other in the adult world.
Mhm.
So I find a lot of that stuff tracks. That's actually hilarious and
Yeah.
totally makes sense.
No, keep
Um,
going. That's so
but
funny.
yeah, so for student government and stuff, I feel like it was really necessary for me to have a social media presence like amongst my student body to like really
That's
campaign.
so interesting. Like
Right.
I like and okay, I think we have to like give people context because I didn't specify our age difference, but I'm only like 7 years older than you. Like
Yeah.
it's not that much, like six,
Yeah.
7 years older than you. And the thought that you use social media to campaign for that, like I just want everyone to know that my campaigning for my middle school and high school, like yeah, that's so crazy to think about. Like I literally was doing posters in the cafeteria. We had to give speeches. Like I'm making it sound like I was doing this in like 1970 something when that's so not true. But like it's really amazing to think about the fact that between like you were saying, like fourth and fifth grade, those things that were the references you made, I was already entering closer to high school.
Yeah.
So when I think about this, the speed of the changes of technology in that time frame, like you were at a point where when Instagram first came around, you were in that middle school phase. And for me, it was more like getting to the end of high school. So it was like, okay, you're not really interacting with Instagram for me until I went to college. So it
Right.
became
Right.
something that was more like part of my actual social life in that regard, just because of the timing of when it happened. But I think it's important for the listener to know, like, we're talking about a really brief time frame here. Like, we're
Yeah.
talking about the difference of somebody who's like only in their early 30s versus somebody who is in that mid 20s range that
Yeah.
like but you still had a significantly different experience with it because like that I never like the only thing I did on Facebook was not until I was in high school and I had a Facebook group telling people to vote for me for my elections, but there was no like campaigning on Instagram. And I have another story I could tell you, but I have to tell it to you offline because it was like a
Okay.
drama at my school, but it was over this topic and it
That's so
had it
interesting.
had to do with like making phone calls like for our board of education elections and they fell on this. I'll give the brief version of like where I'll protect identities, but they fell on the same day, like the day prior to our student council election. And at the time, I was currently holding a student council position. So the president or the principal of my high school asked me to do these recordings. And I could, because of like legalities and like political like rules, when you call people to remind them to vote, you cannot say like what for, because then you're technically like leading them.
Right.
So we made this recording that came from like the town's board of education. And town's board of education was just like, all you can say is in the recording is your name, who you are, and like why you're doing the recording. And then basically it ended with, this is your reminder to vote tomorrow. Like, here are the polling sites and here's when they're open. somebody else who was running against me was assuming that I was doing that to remind people to vote for our student council election. So they thought it was unfair that I got access to do that. And here's where social media comes in. They took to Twitter and started tweeting about me. And then there was like a possible like suspension from school, and it turned into this huge thing. And like it was kind of like bullying a little bit, but to a degree, like I just knew that they were upset about what they perceived to be the reality. But that was like the only time. And again, I was already in high school at this point. So like you were dealing with this on like sixth grade. There's a big difference in the way you evolve as a child and develop between like sixth grade versus being 16 years old. Right.
Yeah.
So it's just really fascinating because I kind of forgot that that happened. And that was truly like my only interaction with using social media for getting people to vote and campaigning. And unfortunately, it was like a really negative one.
Yeah, no, so that there's definitely a duality to it. Like it's definitely not all, rose-colored glasses when looking at social media at
but
that
tell
time.
me like the positive of it for you, because like you said, it sounds like there was actually a benefit to being able to be interconnected that way.
Yeah, no, it was definitely helpful. I think in high school, it was still kind of early stages of like social media meets elections, but it was happening.
Okay.
Like I feel like I did a mix of like posters and like talking to people in person, but it was also like, hey, like I have to make this. If you go deep enough in my Facebook, you can find my high school campaigns.
That's
if
awesome.
you go deep enough in my personal Instagram, you can find my college elections when I was at Berkeley.
Cool.
And like that, yeah. So it's I think in high school it was good. It was more like a, this is a finite community. This is just like reinforcing the message I'm sending in person. In college, it was actually like the only way I think I won, because I also when I was running, it was around COVID times. So like I actually needed social media and that reach, and I needed to like go above and beyond to connect with people. Yeah. So that was interesting. But I think my relationship with social media definitely like continued to evolve right into adulthood. Looks like the use case was like there in like high school and college, but also like socially, you meet people and all that stuff. And I definitely was like more conscious and like, oh, like I need my profile to look a certain way. Like I definitely had those phases in like high school and college and stuff. And yeah, I mean, but I think there are negative sides of it too, right? It definitely was something that was detrimental in certain contexts, I think, when it came to like interpersonal relationships. And I also think it was something that, it led to self-esteem and body image issues, frankly. Nothing crazy, like nothing insane, but just like, the usual thing that girls go through when they're teenagers. So it definitely played into it. So I'm not, I don't take that lightly. I'm not blind to that. But then, in adulthood, I started, when I was in investment banking, I was like really like working all the time and just like kind of lonely. So I started making TikToks, just like me, like word vomiting, literally like no rhyme or reason. Just like, hey guys, like this is what's on my mind today. Like what's going on with you guys? And it just kind of became a thing. And that was crucial because at that point it served as a good tool to like find a community. So then I started like hosting these events, like meeting people in the Muslim community, South Asian communities. And I would argue it's actually what pushed me to find my voice, right? And like understand that I wanted to host like a talk show sort of thing. So it was absolutely crucial in that regard. And then it's a very good tool for viral reach for my talk show too. My talk show is very small, but like the clips that have done well, I mean, it's obviously there are clips on social media, right? It's a brand awareness element is huge. Like the fact that like people I don't know that I meet, well, obviously within specific communities, not like out on the streets.
No,
but they know that I exist, that my show exists with before I even speak to. I mean, that is insane. That is social media doing its thing. And it's a beautiful thing. But with that being said, I've also, whenever I'm off season for my show, which is right now, for example, I make a very active effort to spend less time on social media, because the less productive value I can assign to it, the more it kind of starts erring on the side of like, this is just junk food consumption. This is just me like consuming to blindly consume. And like, it is subconsciously impacting my perception of self. It's and when it comes to like, when you're in this like phase in your 20s, right? People are doing such different things. They're getting married, they're getting engaged. Some of people are traveling the world. And it's really unhealthy, I think, to constantly be like ingesting that information and data points.
Of course.
Comparison. And like, I definitely struggle with that. Like like I have a rule where I'm like, if I see, this is like really bad, but like I have a rule where I'm like, oh, if I see like a couple or proposal on my social media feed, like I'm exiting out for the day. Like I just can't do it. It's just too much for me
I
where I'm
don't
like,
think that's bad. I really respect that. And you know, this conversation is perfectly timed, and I'm sure this is why you had a similar conversation last night because of everything that's been going on with TikTok. But that
yeah,
when I dropped this episode, so the previous 2 episodes before it, for everybody listening to this when the episode airs, I'll have shared 2 solo episodes that I did about TikTok before January 19th. So the first one I recorded prior to whatever the like official decision was going to be reached. So I was
sure.
kind of making my own predictions, but more so talking about what it meant. And I also realized I was glad that I recorded that episode because I also came to the conclusion, I knew this, but it became very evident that a lot of people, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but need to go back to like 7th grade or 8th grade civics class to understand why that happened the way that it did, because
Yeah.
there's like a lot of bullshit on the internet about how it was like
Yeah.
this big conspiracy. And to, again, like we said at the beginning of this, not that we're making this about politics, but I want to be very clear that what happened as a result of January 19th was purely just because like one president was leaving office and another one was coming in. And that just happened to be the timing of like when these bills were going to either go through or not because of the Supreme Court. Like it wasn't this like play. And so I realized that a lot of people were kind of like getting distracted from that or distracting with that we weren't having this bigger conversation about what is your relationship to social media.
Yeah.
So I did a second episode that was about that specifically. And that will be the episode that airs the week before our conversation. So this is kind of a nice piggyback
I
off
love
of that.
that.
Because what I talked about was, for me, on the one hand, as a business owner, I get it. If you were upset about what happened with TikTok, and I'd love to hear for you personally, because you have this really specific use case for it. And as I was recording these episodes, I was wishing I could talk to somebody like you while recording it, because I didn't really buy into TikTok from the jump. And I will say, to give you more context, because you don't know this about me, I lived in China. I studied abroad there.
Wow.
So I was always just like a little skeptical of the thought of something being like a Chinese owned platform in terms of like the longevity of it. And so I was kind of like, I'm just like not going to hitch my band to this wagon sort of thing. And I say that from a place of like, I live there. I know what it's like to experience like living in a communist country. And I was more so just a little concerned about the thought of not of like the data privacy issue that I don't know enough about it, but I can sense that it's something to consider, of course. But I'm also of the camp of like, there's a lot of shit on the internet that we should be concerned about data privacy. So it's like, why are we picking this one thing? But I am concerned from the perspective of somebody who's lived in that country. It's very eye-opening. And I don't know if you've traveled to places like this, so you may have had this experience yourself. It's extremely eye-opening to live somewhere where, especially when you're there for an extended period of time, like I lived there for almost half a year, when you don't have access to get on Google, to get on TikTok, to get on Instagram,
crazy.
like you have VPN and you can figure it out, but it's not always reliable. More importantly, I lived there, and you're pretty young at this time, so I don't know if you remember this happening, but back in like 2014, 2015, Hong Kong wanted to break off from mainland China and become a democracy. So this was not the first time this had been tried. I can't remember. I want to say in the 90s they had attempted to do something like this, but Hong Kong is technically like originally a British colony. And so they tended to, for a long time, like lean more towards like that kind of structure. But at some point they technically became a part of mainland China. So it was technically a communist regime. They wanted to break off from that. And when I was living there, I went to Hong Kong for a school trip. I went to the site of where the protests were. And then when I went back to Shanghai, where I was living, I asked my Chinese tutor, I was like, oh, like, do you know what's going on in Hong Kong right now? No clue. And to know that in the rest of the world, it's like one of the only things playing on TV all day long, I can't even describe the extremity of like what my reaction was to her, for her to be like, nothing's happening in Hong Kong. Like, because that's not what the Chinese government's pushing through their media channels. So for me, that was like, I had this fear of like, oh, I can protect myself from that if I choose to, right?
Yeah.
But like, that was my fear of being like, I don't know about this TikTok thing just because it's connected to China. But again, I'm coming at this from a belief that's rooted in an actual experience. So I'm not just like making it up, right? Like I can kind of say like, hey, like this was just my interaction and I don't expect anybody else to share my opinion, but I wanted to share that perspective because that's the only thing that informed my opinion. Like, and that's fair. Like that's how we all form opinions, right? It's based on your experiences. A lot of times it's based off of people's beliefs, which is a bad excuse for an experience, right? But still, that kind of led me through this bigger like conversation with people on Instagram on the 19th itself. The reactions that people were having to a platform being down for 12 hours tells us everything we need to know about people's mental health, people's ability to become addicted to something and they won't admit it because God forbid you're addicted to something that's not a drug, therefore it's not bad for you. Like that could be a whole podcast. And I saw it like in real life, like the memes that people were putting up. And yes, there is a validity. And as a business owner, I talked about the fact of like, hey, we got to diversify our platforms. Like you got to have an email list. But I fully respect the fact that there are people who really just found TikTok as a place to connect, like you said, as a place to create community. A lot of women have felt that having access to TikTok has made them feel more seen for like medical issues. And I respect that being in the health like realm, and just having more of a voice. And you just said that like the most interesting thing to me that stood out from what you said in the last few minutes was you felt like having this platform for you, it happened to be TikTok, but I think you could make the argument maybe it started with Facebook and Instagram. It kind of pushed you to find your voice. And then obviously by doing it on TikTok, you were getting that feedback loop of like, oh, like people feel like me. Let me talk about this more. I think that's an incredible part about social media. And I totally agree with you. But where I think you have used it in the most positive way that you possibly can. And I see you as somebody who's kind of like squeezed all the juice out of it because ultimately this was the point I made in the podcast episode. So for everybody who didn't listen to that one, you just got like the 4-minute Cliffs Notes version. Is my experience as a business owner is that I would bet on the business owners who take on what I'll call like a hybrid approach, where you see social media as the means, especially if you work brick and mortar, or in your case, where you're saying like, I did these posts that then connected me to other people that you then hosted events, right? And you created these in real life things to really actually like squeeze all the juice from this virtual community and make it a true community in real life. I think those are the people who will always win because you can pivot, you know how to use different types of platforms as leverage, not as the main tool that's driving income or, you know, building your brand or whatever. So I like to think of like that sweet spot that I'm just going to call a hybrid sweet spot, where you recognize that social media not only gives you a voice, but also creates validity for you too. Like for you, and as a Gen Zer, I'm sure you relate to this. If somebody gives you a recommendation for like a restaurant, a hair place, brows, like whatever it is, the first place you're going to go to see if that company is legit, Instagram, TikTok, like that's what you're going to do, right? Like I don't even Google things. My friend will tell me about a restaurant. First thing I do is like, maybe I'll go on Yelp for food, but like for the most part, I'm going right to Instagram. Let me look at their Instagram. What does the vibe look like? What did they put on their stories today? So I get a sense of like what the atmosphere of the restaurant's actually like versus the beautiful pictures that they like, you know, had a ton of lights behind and everything to make it look like the best shot. So all that to say, and I know I just threw a lot at you, but I'd love to just kind of hear your reaction to that, because my take is that it was shocking, but at least like for you, like being honest and knowing your boundary with it, I have so much respect for, because like you said, if you see somebody getting engaged, somebody this happening, that happening, like you don't need an explanation. Like you're not in the headspace that you want to see something like that. I don't think I shared this with you when we first met, but I broke off an engagement. So between ages like 25 to 20, I got engaged at 25, broke it off by 26. So I'd say between ages like 27 up until now, I've done a lot of healing, but it's been very hard for me to see people get married, get engaged, have babies, buy houses, because I've chosen a very different path. And it's something that like I continue to figure out what I want my relationship to be with those things, because I want to be happy for those people, but at the same time I know I'm looking at a different trajectory for myself. So I get it. I totally get it. So I'm curious for you, because you have this like two-part lens of creating this brand, seeing the value of it from a pure business perspective, and obviously having your show, but also from somebody who it sounds like you've really actually utilized it to become the person that you are and like continue to evolve the person that you are. And I just haven't had that experience with TikTok. I would say I've had that experience with Instagram 100%.
Yeah, no, lots of really great points you touched on. I'll try to go through them one by one. So I think first of all, I think you mentioned this earlier on, but my exposure to East Asia, like I think that's like a good starting point for all of this for
because I'd
context.
love to know, because obviously that's an area of the world you have a care about, like probably to the same extent that I do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I definitely haven't ventured into East Asia as much as I'd like to, but I am definitely aware of certain dynamics when it comes to China. So I definitely have, before I get into my personal relationship with social media, I think it's important to lay the backdrop of like, this is the ownership and like, this is what it means. And I'm not, you know, I'm again, this goes back to critical thinking, critical consumption. I'm not one to fall, at least intentionally fall prey to like American propaganda.
Sure.
So that is one thing. But on the other hand, I do think that people, everyday Gen Z consumers and millennials, I don't think a lot of them can fully grasp the dangers of data collection. I don't think people truly understand what that means. I also don't think people know what the Chinese, well, any government, I don't want to just single out China.
I totally agree.
Right.
Yeah.
So if it were to flip, right? If China didn't want America to own their data, I'd be like, dude, that's all fine. Fair. That is
right.
Valid.
Exactly. Totally agree with you.
But I do have a distrust with the Chinese government, and you don't have to air this part if it's not politically what the, you know, but for me, just as a Muslim, knowing what they're doing behind closed doors with the Uyghur genocide, it's a high tech genocide, with the entire Uyghur Muslim population in China. Nobody knows how many Uyghurs have been killed. I met, somebody that escaped, at a conference. And just hearing her story, I mean, she couldn't speak English, but there was a translator. Just hearing her story like brought me to tears. And like my cousin, she's like very involved with the campaign, which is so just hearing my cousin's perspective, the work that she's done.
You have a personal connection to it, the same way I'm describing. Yeah,
exactly. So for me, I just have an inherent mistrust in the Chinese government. So I'm just going to go and start with that. And that might be controversial, but that's my take.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
So I'm like, you know, it's not necessarily, like communism versus cap. It's not even about that. It's just like a, you know,
it's just like, it's like, if we take like the label of like communism off of it, I would even just make the argument, it's like technically just the culture. Because like they don't question it. Like that was the part for me that like really, because I know the genocide that you're talking about, and I actually learned about it when I was there. And I will also make the same statement that like, it's just shocking that no one knows about these things, but it's also not shocking when you live there and then you understand that there's just this expectation culturally that you don't question authority, because that's what it comes down to. That's it. Like you're right. Like it's not communist versus capitalist. It's just like, what's your relationship to authority, I think is like the broader question, you know?
Yeah. So exactly. So with that backdrop, I've always been uncomfortable with the thought of it, but I'm like, you know, whatever, everybody's on it. It is what it is.
Right.
But I also have a philosophy of like, and this is my own, maybe like hyper independence to a flaw, but like, I just don't believe in like reliance on like any substance, any platform, any people, this is where it's a problem, by the way. But any people,
I was going to say, when you add people into it, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. It actually becomes, it's actually not the healthiest thing probably. But with the exception being like my parents, right? I think that's like the one thing where I'm like, I will allow myself to fully trust and rely with like blood relatives. But outside of that, I definitely have this like, anyway, that's a separate thing. But that kind of bleeds into the social media thing, because it's just like, okay, well, you know, I like TikTok, you know, before my talk show, right? The thing was like, okay, I like TikToks. I like going viral. I like the dopamine rush. I like likes. I like comments. I like followers. Like who doesn't like that? And especially,
and it was also cool to hear you. I want to emphasize this one thing you said, just because I talked for so long. When you mentioned that you had you had the college experience through COVID. So like that was isolating to a degree. And then you also mentioned that when you graduated and you then took on a really intense job, and you felt really disconnected from a social perspective, even though, yes, there's people at work, it's intense. The goal of being there is to try to get as much work done in a lot of volume. And for sure, like having worked in finance, it's one of those things where if you do happen to have like a really good cohort of other people that graduated with you and are in that like incoming analyst class with you, definitely changes the experience. But if you don't, it can be pretty lonely to a degree because like there's a separation between having work friends and having your personal life friends. And I think something else you really emphasized very well before is just the fact that like you also wanted to be around people that had similar culture to you and looked like you and identified with you in that regard. And you didn't necessarily have access to that either. So I think that's really important for people to hear, is that one of the things that like was like the underlying point of this for you and what you were looking to get out of it was that sense of connection for sure. And I really appreciate that.
No, thank you for touching on that, because it's definitely a huge component of all of it. But because of that, you know, even when I was in my like dopamine rush of like that, like likes and comments and followers in the thousands and all that stuff, like I definitely like was very clear that like if all of this went away tomorrow, like I would be fine. Like I was very clear on that like, and this isn't even from like like if Chinese owners, it was just like a general thing of like separation of like,
because even Instagram could be gone tomorrow. Like let's remind everybody of that. The internet, like God forbid something happened, like and that's like a real scare for people. Like I think about that often. If for some reason like the internet, like we went off grid, then I would have to really rethink some things about my business because I also have clients virtually. So for sure, I would pivot. I love doing things in person, but at the same time, fundamentally, there are things that would just not allow my business to function. And for all of us, what about even the financial like aspect of that, of like the exchange of money, right? So like there's a lot of issues that would come with that, but you're right. Like we should also really emphasize the fact like this has nothing to do with TikTok to a degree. It's like any of these platforms.
Exactly. And I think that's been something that's been very tried and true to the way that I try to approach life. Now with the show, you know, TikTok is obviously a good tool. Social media is a good tool. But ultimately I've also told, I love the show, by the way. I'm not saying I don't, but I think it's one of those things where it's like, you know, if this had to disappear tomorrow for whatever reason, like I think I'd have to find a way to be okay. Cause I think you have to have an identity outside of like relying on these things.
You do.
Right? Right. And so I think like as a person that's built a brand on TikTok, I obviously would not love to lose that overnight. But I recognize that like everybody's experiencing some sort of loss, and mine's not that big because I also made it a point to never rely on it as a stream of income. I never try to monetize it too much because I was like, I just have a full-time job. So like, it's like, I'm just going to focus on that for money. And this is more for fun. But I do feel very deeply. I have a lot of friends in the creator space who rely on that income that comes from data. I really feel for them. So that's not to undermine that experience, but this was just mine because of the way that I had been fortunate enough to position myself with the use of social media. So obviously, like if it went away, I was like, that's fine. We have Instagram Reels, like whatever, like it is what it is. We have YouTube Shorts. Like, I don't care. It's all, for me, it's all the same because I'm not relying on any single platform as a source of income. So it's easy for me to say that, but obviously the narrative shifts if that is the case. And I empathize and recognize that.
Yeah. And then from more of like a true consumer perspective for you in potentially losing it in that regard, like it sounds like you've been really grounded with it from the beginning, forgetting the brand aspect and like truly just from somebody who's on there getting information. For you, what is your reaction to that aspect of it? Like if you did imagine the fact that like it would go away tomorrow, I guess to be more specific with this question, I saw a lot of content that I think is valid. I just never analyzed it to this degree myself because I don't use TikTok as frequently. But one of the things that a lot of people were saying that makes it really different is the algorithm itself is like a true search engine, where Instagram just doesn't have that like level of ability with the way the algorithm is designed. Like you have to spend more time interacting with certain content to be fed certain content. Whereas my understanding of TikTok is it's like almost instantaneous where you like watch one video and that can become your whole thing. And when you search for things, like you get way more depth on some of that. So definitely. For you, like, I don't know how much time it sounds like you're describing your interaction more from like you posting and then like using it as a way to build, but like from the whole perspective of like straight up like scrolling. Like I understand that it's a different type of scrolling experience, we could call it, which is so bizarre to delineate, but I think it's important because that sounds like to me, from what I was reading, from what people felt really upset by, and what I also think is part of the potentially unhealthy aspect of it too, because let's be clear here, the reason why people have developed the addiction to it is because of the feature that I just described. It's not just the likes, it's not just the, it's people who like maybe don't even post anything on it, but they're using it, like using it from the perspective of looking up information. Do you have a relationship to that, or that's not really been your experience with using it, just given what you've done with your show and everything?
Yeah, I think definitely. I definitely have, again, ebbs and flows, a relationship with the consumption of content on TikTok. I would categorize most of my like non-show related, like show related is different. Like I'm looking for creators, that's different.
Yeah, and you want to connect with people to have on the show too.
Exactly. But I'll say if I had to isolate the two, right? I would say that the other one was just brain rot. Like, I mean, like I don't really feel like I've been, I mean, no, okay, that's not true. There were things that I learned. I feel like especially after October 7th with the genocide in Palestine and Gaza. And that was sort of a really good platform for me to learn through, even though a lot of stuff was being shadow banned. I felt like it was a good platform to like really understand certain things. So I appreciated it in specific moments, but I think overall I would say net negative. It was all brain rot. Like, yeah, sure, you can. I also get very overwhelmed by like information. If there's like an overload of information, like I can't digest it. So when it came to like, planning vacations or picking restaurants, I would be like, everything looks good. Like, I don't know. Like, I can't pick anything. Somebody else please pick for me. I definitely
tend to be like that too. So I get that.
Yeah. I'm definitely like a great case of like analysis paralysis, like paradox of choice. I'm like, I don't know. There's just so much on the internet. I don't know. Somebody just pick for me, please.
Sure.
So I didn't use it as a search engine as much as I recognize people find the utility in doing so. So I don't know. I mean, for me, if I want to go to a restaurant, like, yes, I maybe I do look it up on TikTok sometimes, but I start with Google Maps, and I'm like, okay, where is this located?
Especially being in food?
I don't know.
Yeah. Especially being in New York. I think that's an important thing for us to distinguish too, because I could say that for myself as well. Like coming and having moved really recently, like this behavior change is super apparent to my own day to day. In living in New Jersey, where I was living before this, I know where everything is. So I don't need to look at anything on a map. And certain neighborhoods already have certain connotations. And when it comes to a place like New York, like we're saying, there's so many options that you will look at things on the map first, because how far away is this from me? How am I getting there? What neighborhood is it in for me to get an understanding of like, well, if I don't like this place, what else is around it? We're females. We got to ask the question, is it safe? If I'm not going without friends, like we got to think about all these things. Those questions can really best be answered by first looking at a map. And as we know, because really we're just like talking about the interconnectedness of all these platforms, you can now go on Apple Maps, where a few years ago, it didn't have the functionality that as soon as you search for a place, like the Yelp features came up. That was probably like subconsciously, none of us paid attention to that. But I think like living in New York City, was like a genius integration that just about anybody can appreciate, but it just happens. So I think you raised like a really good point there, because the other thing that I think is like kind of fascinating and actually says a lot in like contrast to what I was saying before about information being controlled. And, you reference like the shadow ban aspect of things too. In you mentioning like learning about different events and like current events, something that I found kind of interesting from not being on TikTok. And I'll add as one aside, one of the other reasons why I just like never jumped on it was because when I did try to use it, I don't know what it was for me. Like I care a lot about like visual and like spatial things. And I just felt very overwhelmed trying to edit content on it, to the point where I was like, I can't use this. Like there was just something about it that I just could never like get over the hump. I always saw Instagram as quote unquote easier. And I do believe in like the psychology aspect of color. And because Instagram is like mostly black, I find that it's easier for me to take in some of the information. And because TikTok is white, by the way, people, this is not an accident that it's white and there's more color that actually plays into the dopamine hits that you're getting. But for me, that just played into being like, I'm too overwhelmed by like the user interface of this, that I just couldn't get, I could never scroll on it for that reason, because I was like, I can't get sucked into this because there's like too much happening, if that makes sense. So that's one thing. But the second thing that really kind of like my ears perked up when you said this was, I actually sometimes felt like a little out of the loop. I can't remember this person's name, but, and I wish that I could, because they deserve to be noted, because they went through arguably horrible experience. But this is not the first time something like this has happened. But people would ask me like, oh, did you hear about that court case where this person's being tried for like murder, and it's being covered on TikTok from like all these different angles? And that is fascinating, because when you think about what we did not have access to, where we started this entire conversation, of how people were not as connected years ago, how people couldn't do those things years ago, it makes you kind of wonder, like, are there people who didn't get as much justice as they potentially deserved? How do these platforms play into things like that to give these people of not just a voice, but like that, I don't want to use the word recognition because I know there's a better word for it, but to give them a platform to possibly raise more awareness. That's probably the better word. Awareness, support, and just making people more informed, because they're finding out about it on TikTok. I actually think that's kind of cool. And that's something that the reason why I mentioned is kind of like the antithesis of what I was saying before, is because that goes against the idea of media being controlled. Like, it's giving you access to something that maybe you wouldn't have known about otherwise. And sometimes my friends would be like, oh yeah, like, did you hear about this thing on TikTok? And they tell me that they went down this rabbit hole of learning about this case from like every possible angle. My argument back to that, for me personally, that's how I view podcasts. Like, as a podcast host, I don't know if you consume a lot of podcasts. I am a freaking podcast junkie. I listen to them all day long. I listen to it instead of music. But like you, I've had to learn that like the overconsumption of the information. And this is something that's really helped me personally, of just regulating my own nervous system, spending more time focusing on my relationship with myself. I've actually had to set boundaries with it being okay with things being silent. Because really, if you dig deep and understand from a consciousness perspective why I do that, talking about me personally rather than labeling other people, if you're out there and you listen to podcasts a lot, just sit with what I'm about to say. But it's usually a sign that like you are avoiding your own thoughts, and it may not be like really intentional of like, oh, like, I don't want to think about this really traumatic thing. It more just may be like you haven't developed this ability to be comfortable with just you, sit with just you. And as a result, that turns into you saying things like, I don't like silence. I need to have music playing. I need to have this going on. And so that was like a challenge for me that I set for myself in 2024. And I'm really glad that I did that, because I believe it's made me a more grounded person in so many ways. Yet at the same time, I also struggled from like an identity perspective, because my friends have labeled me as like the go-to person for if they need a podcast recommendation, or if I send them a podcast, they know it's going to be good. And so there was a part of me that was like, oh, I can't do that if I had an identity tied to that. So say all that to say, it's like you get these same like things from each of these platforms. It probably just depends on your personality, your experiences, like what we're saying. But I think it's just, I hope, and my ultimate takeaway from this entire like 21-day window, by the time all of these episodes that I'm sharing this thought process on airs, is that I hope that even just like the lack of access to this platform for 12 to 14 hours, no matter its fate, and speaking to any platform across the board, I really hope it helps people take the time to be a little more critical about their relationship to it. And that was the message of my last episode. That's like, hey, if this made you feel some type of way, even if my podcast like made you feel called out in some kind of way, I would challenge you and urge you to examine your relationship with it, because it was kind of like test of like, how are you going to respond to this situation actually happening if it were to become a permanent situation?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that also ties in really beautifully full circle to the original question you asked me, like, who are you, right? Outside of all the titles and things that you do around the city. And yeah, I mean, it's just about critical thinking and critical consumption. I mean, that's just the level of acute awareness of like, what is it all that we're ingesting on a daily basis and why?
Yeah. So, and I'd love to ask you to take that one step further too. thinking about the fact that you moved to New York, like you said, you're like right out of college, you're excited, you're ready to go, and you've been here for the last 3 years. Obviously, you grew up in an area that was still like very much a city, not to the degree that New York is, but I know you were pretty close to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And they have their each like has its own uniqueness for sure. But I would love to hear your perspective on what I think is like a little bit of a trope, and it depends on your personality, but people tend to say like, oh, it's really hard to make friends going into your mid 20s and your 30s, moving to big cities like New York City. And I would have the impression from how easy it was for us to meet. Like, by the way, for the listeners, we literally just met like talking in line at an event, and we just started chatting, and we talked for like probably 40 minutes about so many
Shout
different
out
things.
Sabine.
Yeah. So thank you to Sabine for that. It was awesome.
Yeah.
And even knowing her, like doing cool stuff and us talking about like how you met her, like I think that is so amazing. I'm obsessed with the concept of like the invisible string and how people are like connected in some way. And I love connecting other people. Like if I can be that like common thread, I'm like, oh, I know this person. Let me introduce you. I know this person. They can help you. Like that is one of my favorite things to do for people. So I want to know for you, having had this experience living in New York for the past 3 years, navigating, like you got a lot of history. You navigated college through COVID when that changed your social life dramatically at a very critical time, I believe, for you to be like 20, 21 years old going through that. Probably pretty freaking hard, regardless of age, like hard, but I think especially hard. Like I feel for people who had that college experience. And then 2, moving to a city in like a post-COVID time, things were still like kind of questionable in some people's minds. Then you went into a very intense job. I know you've switched jobs since, but like cumulatively, what would you say to the person out there who maybe thinks it's hard to make friends? Or what is your like takeaway from the last 3+ years of you living here?
Yeah. Well, it really, honestly, it just depends on what phase you're in, right? Like for me personally, when I first moved to New York, I was like super into it. I was like, I just want to meet everybody all the time because, oh my God, look at all
energy.
these people and all these people from different walks of life. Like I need to consume all of this and like understand the world, which was fun. But I think it's really phase dependent, right? Because I'm like, now I'm at a point where I'm like, I'm kind of tired. Like, I kind of just like, I go to work, I work on my show. I'm off season right now. So right now I'm just focusing on my health and like connecting with the people I already have in my life through college. I will say I'm very fortunate to have like a whole pipeline of people from the Bay Area that moved to New York, people from UC Berkeley that come to New York, people in the creator space that are already in New York. I'm really grateful for that. But to the original question, what is your advice to somebody that's struggling to make friends? I think you really get what you put in. You have to show up. You have to learn to just like show up to events alone. And that's what I started. That's literally how I started. I didn't know like anybody really, like maybe a handful of people. I would literally just show up I would see something online on social media and be like, oh, this looks cool. I'll go show up. I would go alone. I just be like, what's your name? Oh, cool. I just moved here. Oh, you too? Cool. Let's get coffee. Like you have to do that. You have to go out of your way and be comfortable in your own skin, introduce yourself to people, put yourself in the room, seriously. But also you don't need to do that all the time. I'm tired of doing that. I don't do it anymore. I'm exhausted. If there's an event where people are meeting each other, I'm like, I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole because I'm just tired. I'm so overstimulated.
It's like, you know yourself too. So once again, let's go back to the coffee, right? Like it's related to that because you've mentioned like, that you get a little too much stimulation from a lot of information.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've done like one of those Myers-Briggs like personality tests, and I can probably guess what yours is, but like it comes with like, I feel like between ages like 26 to 30 is when I've become more aware of that point that you just made myself, because I would say I have that in common with you. Like I am extroverted in the sense that I get tons of energy off of being around other people, to the point where I've actually gotten advice from a coach that I work with on how to schedule my day and just like looking at like how I spend my time. And it's something I'm kind of obsessed with because I am totally in control of my own time. And that can be a business owner's sometimes like Achilles heel in a way, right? You get caught up in the wrong tasks or like too much pressure of like, well, if I'm not working, then like, how am I going to keep growing this thing? So I've grappled with that a lot for like the last 2 years in particular. And so something I've just come to learn in like the last month is, in an effort, and we'll tie this back to health and wellness, because I do want to ask you one other question about that, because you just mentioned it. In an effort to try to get better sleep, to have better boundaries with technology, to be able to perform better at all the things that I want to achieve, I've been trying to, say no to more things, put my phone down, all that kind of stuff. And I found myself in this situation a couple weeks ago. I had gone to this girls' night and I met like 7 people who I didn't know any of them. We didn't know each other. And we went around the room and the host was awesome and made it like very intentionally like a way for all of us to talk. So we had like cards of the topics we were going to like say about ourselves. I was like exploding with energy after, and I felt like, shoot, it's like 11 o'clock at night. I really like should go to bed, but I can't because my brain was just like, oh, I got to do this. I have this idea. Like I was feeling this like level of like energy that I actually just sat down and made some content instead of judging myself for being like, no, like you should be in bed at this particular time. And I have the flexibility to rearrange my next day so that if I want to sleep in later, and I get that that's not everyone's luxury, but being a business owner also comes with its share of stressors that if that's the one thing I get to have as a luxury, I'll take it. So I think like something that is really, really the most important thing between what we said about coffee, what we said about you finding your voice, what you said about being a critical thinker, what we said even about our interactions with social media, it just comes down to the notion of you actually getting to know yourself and then acting in alignment with the things that are who you are. Or if you're looking to change who you are, because that's also perfectly acceptable. And that's what I do with people on a daily basis, like literally, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about the future version of yourself. How does she show up? How does she or he decide to make those decisions in a way that you're thinking about that future version of you? Because that's how you're going to get to know yourself and be more comfortable expressing yourself. Like you said, putting yourself in the room, but then also knowing like, it's like an investment. You put the work in for the first few years that maybe now you don't feel this like sense of like, not that you felt like you had to do that in the beginning. There was an excitement factor to something being like a shiny new object, of course. But I think it all just comes back to this idea of like, this is representative of you knowing yourself. And again, I said this before in saying to you that I really admire how eloquent you are and the way you carry yourself. Going down to like the context of somebody's age, the way you're able to speak also has to do with the fact that you have developed your voice. Like you said, like, you know yourself and you're convicted in what you're saying. So of course you're going to say it with this confidence and using the right words. And I can tell that you're thoughtful about them, but I also can tell, and I am this way, so I probably pick up on this more than the average person. We both talk like pretty quickly because our brains are going really fast. And that's my favorite kind of person to talk to. Cause I'm just like, yeah, like keep going, girl. Like I want to hear what you have to say about this. And I love that. And I think that's why in the first like 40 minutes of us meeting, we talked about so many things. Like so many things. And that's my favorite kind of person to talk to. Some people probably think I'm like way too much to like take in. And I'm like, that's fine. You're not my person. But I really love that. And I think the one other thing you mentioned that I would be remiss, this being a fitness and wellness podcast, but truthfully, this show is definitely evolving a lot right now for me. Just in the beginning of 2025, I've started to talk about more of like my reaction to things I'm seeing in the news, like in the context of the health and wellness space. But it's always been a show where I want to highlight women. And obviously you have such a cool perspective and you're doing cool things. So this to me was like a no brainer to have you on. But you also said something just now about like taking a, like looking at your show in seasons and how you take a break. And you said like, I use this time to work on my health. What does that mean for you? And if whether that's come from you maybe feeling like when you are juggling a lot between a full-time job, being a creator, producing this show, have you found that your health tends to kind of take a back seat? And if that is the case, when you have this, let's downtime in quotes, because I'm sure you're still a very busy person, because that's probably just how you're wired. What is that like, you taking care of yourself and your health? Like, how does that show up? What are you doing on a daily basis? And kind of talk to me about that routine, because I think that's a really important perspective to highlight, especially for this podcast too.
Yeah, no, definitely. Right up the alley. It makes sense on a lot of different fronts. So I think background is important. When I was in investment banking, I like was sleeping very little, eating like outside food because they pay for your lunch your dinner.
Yeah.
And you have to eat out for lunch too because you're at the office, obviously. So you just don't have any time to do anything, right? So when I left, I made it a priority to learn how to cook like Pakistani, like healthy meals at home. Like
That's
that
so
was like
cool.
really important for me
Yeah.
in my time when I was in between jobs. So, and then when I started working this current job, I still do finance, but I do it for a private equity owned beauty company. And the work-life balance is a lot better, and I really enjoy the product, the people. It's a great place to work. And in that, I think when I first started working there, I would still kind of, when I was working on that and my show, I would just like
Mhm.
grab like something from the deli, like grab
Yeah.
something quick for dinner. But in my downtime, what I'm trying to do, at least in this break between seasons, is like I've been sleeping a lot earlier on weekdays. Weekends, I still, go see my friends, come home,
Yeah.
whatever.
Want to have fun.
But on weekdays, I like am still trying to be in bed by a good time, eating home cooked meals on the weekdays. Walking. I've been walking. I hate the subway. It's like a whole separate thing. But I like recently just started like walking like literally everywhere. It's like actually insane, by the way, because sometimes I have to leave my house like an hour before a plan starts
I
to
was
like
gonna say that's very committed. I respect it.
very committed. But also I want to caveat that with like I'll use the bus if I need to, or like
Mhm.
if I absolutely have to, I'll use the subway. But I really, really strongly have started disliking the subway very recently. So I think it's just like little lifestyle changes. Like I'm not somebody that's like gotten to the point of like I'm going to the gym every day. Like I'm not doing that yet, but I want to just work on lifestyle changes. And I used to track my macros, and I realized I got into an unhealthy relationship with tracking, so I just stopped doing that. But at least I know like what is healthy to ingest
Mhm.
and not, and I have a rough sense of like serving size from that like month or two I was macros tracking last year. So I think for me it's just like that. It's just like it's really simple things. It's just like food, sleep, and walking. And just like
Yeah.
that in itself takes up time and
Hell
like
yeah, it does. Did
planning.
everybody hear that? You should say that again, girl, because it's like the basics that people think are not enough. And I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually what jogged my memory of like the first topic that we connected on when we met. And when I told you what I did, you started telling me about
Yes.
these transitions in your life. And I also
Yeah.
asked you, like, what was your experience like? Because I knew your answer and I wanted to know from your experience
Yeah.
of transitioning out of investment banking. But people think that it's sometimes not enough, especially the women that I work with. And you fall into that category of like the very like typical attributes of somebody that I support when it comes to fitness and nutrition. And it's like, you're a go getter. So in your mind, it's like, oh, it's not only about sleep. It's not only about walking. It's not only about getting enough protein. I also got to work out X number of days. I have to do this. I have to do that. And it's like sometimes actually we got to do less,
Yeah.
right? And we got to pull back. And
Yeah.
I really, really want everyone to hear what Sandalina said because you have not like extensively listened to my podcast and you still said the exact
I
principles
love
of what
that.
we focus on inside of the Fitness Fix. Like you don't even know my pitch for working together and like that is it to a T. So I am so happy from this conversation to know that like you've gotten that information from somewhere, but it still comes back to you knowing yourself and meeting yourself exactly where you are. And that's a big thing that I think is missing from the health and fitness space. Unfortunately, like it's
Yes.
moving in the right direction, but it's missing because of social media that there's still people out there with these like crazy high bars for what they're telling you to do, the
Yeah.
contradictions, the too much information, and on and on and on. And you saying, like, hey, I'm emphasizing the shit out of taking steps, like physically steps every day, but also these basic steps of
Yeah.
sleeping and just like recovering a little bit more. It's totally overlooked. And I would
Yeah.
question, like, do you think you have more of an appreciation for that because you did like experience like the polar opposite of when you were just like really reactive with your food and really not sleeping?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think like I definitely somebody actually mentioned this to me recently, the concept of sleep debt. And I think that's like a real thing. And when I heard
Yeah,
that term, I was
it
like,
is. You
wait,
can't get it back.
yeah,
It's major.
yeah.
You can't. Yeah.
So there's that. And I think also just like in investment banking, the only break time I got was eating. So I
And you
think
were
that
still kind of simultaneously not like taking a
that's
full break. Yeah.
exactly. But I think like I actually noticed I noticed this in retrospect when I left. I think I would overeat to elongate my time away from my computer. So I was like,
Oh,
I noticed that and I was like, ooh. So I think I've just had so
that's
many
interesting.
experiences. Yeah. And it was so subconscious because I didn't realize it till afterwards. I was like, that's actually
Yeah.
kind of weird. What? But
Yeah.
I think definitely like I think, yeah, I mean, all of it is because there was a lack of it, right? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And I would say
Mhm.
that like this level of just like, hey, I just need to like get the basics down. Like forget the
Yeah.
macros tracking, forget the protein powder, forget the gym. Like I actually just need to like get my like really like basics in.
Mhm.
And honestly, I feel great. Like I
Good.
feel so much better. Like, and it's great. And I feel like
I'm so proud of
I've
you.
been seeing many results. I just got on this regimen like more recently, but I've been seeing many results already. And I'm like, wow, like I
Good.
didn't even, that's cool. I'm just doing basic things. Look at
And
that.
isn't it cool that you feel really good from doing something that actually is not hard as long as you
Yeah.
make it your North Star, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
if everyone could get to a place where knowing that nailing the basics doesn't have to feel hard, I never like to say, and I make this distinction on Instagram a lot, fat loss and taking care of your health, I will never say it's easy, but it is simple. And there's
Yeah,
a difference between easy and simple.
I
And a
agree.
lot of times hard gets thrown into the mix unnecessarily because you're trying to like jump to the next thing. I like the analogy of like a lot of people will step over $100 bills and pick up pennies and like really get lost in the weeds of things. And it's so great to hear from you the testimony of, hey, I feel so much better. And like, by the way, this like, it was a simple change. Like in a way, was it hard to execute? When you had the corporate job that you had a few years ago, of course
Yeah,
it was hard to execute unless you wanted
yeah,
to lose your job. Like I understand that that's like a reality, and
yeah.
I think that there's not enough people talking about that side of it, where there's coaches out there who are just like, well, this is what you have to do and you need to figure out a way to do it. It's like,
Right.
no, like we
Exactly.
need to meet people exactly
Where
where
they
they're
are.
at. And like, it's okay that you're not going to the gym multiple days a week. I would tell you, like, ride that out as long as you can from the perspective of what I mean. Like, as long as you can, you're going to get to a point where you're like, hey, like, I know the value of maintaining my muscle mass. I know the value of putting
Yeah,
on more muscle. And it just could be one of those things, though, where you don't need to go from walking all the time and feeling really good about that to then making this assumption for yourself that you now need to immediately be in the gym 4 days a week strength training. How about one?
exactly.
And then once you really
Exactly.
like
Baby
it,
steps.
guess what? Maybe two, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is my coaching hat going on hard, but like I
No, I
just love
love
that
it.
that's the way that you think, because that is like a really big mission for me, and I'm really glad that you've been able to discern that from, it sounds like, just learn again, knowing yourself, but conversations with your friends and telling other people this too. Like, I
Yeah.
want everyone to hear this, because it's not like you're someone who's come on here and has had a coaching experience with me. So for you to say that, I just want you to know, like, really lands, because I'm like, yes, like this is what everyone needs to keep thinking about. And I don't care how you learned it. I just want to know that you learned it.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That's so
Yeah.
beautiful. Full
It's
circle.
awesome,
There we
right?
go.
Totally. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and I know we can talk forever. So that was, like we said, we've got a few, like, we did a really good job connecting the dots here. And I always love podcasting with another host, because you get it. You're good at like weaving things in and having that through line all the way through. So I appreciate you, because it's fun to just be able to have two people who can go back and forth and each
Yeah.
respectively like talk for a few minutes and then be like, oh, you said a lot, let me digest
Let me
this and hit,
unpack.
yeah. And I love that. So for everybody who's listening, who's listened to this show for a while, you guys know that sometimes I'm like, I need to work on that and not say so much, but I get excited. And it's great when I'm matched with the energy of somebody who kind of thinks that way too. And you're like, yeah, like I
I
can keep
totally get
moving
it.
through this. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I love it. You're a great host, by the way.
Thank
You
you.
you ask great questions. I was like, I haven't had to think like this in a while.
Well,
So it's
that's because
good.
I know you're busy with your finance job, and you're like in your major like formulas and Excel spreadsheets and all those things. So like you are thinking, but in a very different way,
Different
right?
way. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's
So
nice to
that's
be,
cool.
yeah,
That's
probed like
awesome.
this. So thank you for
Well,
having me.
yeah, I appreciate you. Before we let you go, one last question. And
Yeah.
then after answering this, please, of course, also tell us where we can stay connected with you. Your show, we'll link all that down in the show notes so that
Yeah.
everybody can keep in touch and get to see more of your perspective and all that critical thinking going on. But if somebody, we covered clearly a lot of ground, but if somebody could only really take away one thing from this conversation, and maybe it's something you haven't even said, but something that you want to leave people with for them to consider, like, what is that overarching message for you?
Mhm. I think for me it's just everybody has an inner voice. You just got to listen to it.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think
Love
that's
it.
been my biggest guiding light for the past like 2.5 years in New York, a few years in college before that. Yeah.
Love it. Amazing. Well, where can we follow you on social media? What are your main platforms? We have a guess based on what you said.
Yes, 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 yes. So my show is Spotlight with Sandalina, which is spelled exactly how it is in the background here. So
Perfect.
look at that. And my personal Instagram, if that matters, is Sandalina Sattar, Sattar. So just Sandalina
Perfect.
and then Sattar. My personal TikTok, I actually like went private on it because I was like, I don't even know if I need this stuff public anymore. Like, I don't even know who I am anymore. So I get, yeah, I have phases with that. But yeah, those are the social media that I would.
Awesome.
And I'm on
Beautiful.
YouTube too. The show's on YouTube, Spotify,
Cool.
Apple Podcasts, everywhere. But
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. I'm excited for everybody to hear this one, get their reactions to it, and just have some really good conversations coming off of this. So thank you so much for your time and for joining the FYX listeners today, and for everybody who joined us from wherever you're listening from. I appreciate all of you guys for being here, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. We will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks, Sandalina.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.